first presentation that we're going to listen to is quite unusual since it will be covering a very unusual issue, that of Korean immigrants in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and how this Korean community has transformed their know-how that normally belongs at home, cooking for people at home. They've turned it into an actual business. And by doing so, they've changed their statute in a society. So this presentation was put together by two researchers who are in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. Now, I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce their name properly. We've got Jung Eun Lee, who studied geography in Korea and who is currently completing a PhD in Argentina on migration and political space. And then we have Romina Delmonte, who is also a PhD in sociology at the Buenos Aires University and who works on the construction of identity of Asian migrants in Latin America through food and foodways. So the title of the communication is Hansik, that's traditional Korean food, the privileged place of women of the Korean community in Buenos Aires. And they're going to tell us how these women have changed their stars and their place in society. I don't know who wants to kick off out of the two of you. I believe that we have a presentation with some slides. I'll let you take care of that. And if it doesn't work for some reason, I think that Florent might be able to take over and help you out to put the presentation up on the screen. So don't hesitate to tell us if it doesn't work. So who's going to start?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well, Romina. Thank you very much. You've got 20 minutes.
Is going to be sharing from her computer the slides. I think that, well, first of all, thank you for all the organizers and well, I listening myself is in English and also with the translation in Spanish, so I turned that off. I want to start by thank you all of you, the organizers and the scientific committee, for the valuable comments on our previous versions of the paper. So as Nicolas said, this is our paper that we wrote with my colleague Jung-Eun Lee, entitled Handshake, the Privileged Place of the Women of the Korean Community in Buenos Aires. And we wanted to start the presentation by asking you about Handshake. Do you know what Handshake is? Have you heard of any Handshake campaign in your city? And I think that the organizers, I think that you can see the poll on your screens, so you can vote.
Yes, Romina, indeed, participants are currently voting. I believe you can see as well the participant responses.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, some of you are still voting. And have you heard anything about Handshake? And the other, most of you didn't hear about any Handshake campaign in your city and a small Handshake campaign. So we're going to start by saying that Handshake is a Korean word to refer to Korean cuisine, Korean food. And in this paper, we will explore the relationship between Korean women in Buenos Aires and their knowledge in food work related to Handshake, to Korean food. So if we go, that's right. Well, as Nicolas also said previously, Chong and I have been researching for our master's and now for our PhD thesis about Korean migrations in Buenos Aires. And while Chong has focused on geographical and territorial transformations, in my case, the interest is towards food practices and identity construction processes. So in this paper, we propose to reflect about the changes that affect gender relations by observing the food sector, especially focusing on Korean women in Buenos Aires. And some of the questions that trigger our interest were related to the ways in which foodscapes are involved in the transformations of urban spaces, on how migration processes transform cities, and in which ways women's trajectories and life projects are articulated with urban contexts and gender identities. So with these questions in mind and taking into account our previous research, we found that Korean cuisine has experienced a process of revalorization in Buenos Aires, and considering that there is a traditional gender representation that links women and hanshik and Korean food, we argue that for Korean women in Buenos Aires, there has been a double process of revalorization of their culinary knowledge that in this context becomes a more valued culinary capital. So if you go to the next slide, we use this concept of culinary capital that has been proposed by scholars studying gender and food practices before, such as Leves Nacarato and Lasil and Vegan. And as you might know or suspect, it derives from Pierre Bourdieus' notion of cultural capital that states that certain non-monetary assets, such as cultural knowledge, can become valued in certain social contexts. So the value of this capital may not be monetary, or it may be. It depends on the field within which it is located, but may be expressed in power and status. So this is the central concept for our argument, and we find it very useful to understand the contradictory nature of this process that we are going to see with more detail right now. So if we go to the next slide, this is how the presentation is organized. First, we briefly describe Korean migration and enclaves in Buenos Aires. Then we will focus on the main argument that states there has been this twofold process of revalorization of this culinary capital. First, we will describe the first moment related to the migratory process itself, and then we will outline the main characteristics of the second one and its impact on women's access and agency on three different spaces: media spaces, institutional spaces, and territorial spaces. So now I let Chong continue with her part.
Well, hello. My name is Chong-eun, and pleased to present our study this time. Briefly, I'd like to introduce the history of Korean migration in Buenos Aires in Argentina, which has developed a strong urban concentration and territorial patterns in Buenos Aires. Since the first arrivals in the 1960s, even if it's not really easy to give the exact number of Korean immigrants, according to the Korean Association in Argentina, there were more than 70,000 Korean-born immigrants living in their peak during the 90s and 80s and 90s. As you can see in the map, there are two center or main Korean enclaves, where you see the red one, which is the old Korean enclaves, and it is called Baekgu, and it is known as Korean Town or Barrio Coreano in Buenos Aires. And after 2001, or before the 2001, the orange one, Avellaneda, became have been constructing very rapidly as the second or the new Barrio Coreano, where many garment industry or textile shops are concentrated. So these photos are taken in Baekgu area, the old Korean town, which some of you can see, maybe find some similarities of Korean town in your cities. We brought these photos to give a hint of this Korean town in Buenos Aires. Maybe some of you have visited, or some of you haven't. No. Anyway, as you can see, the places in this old Korean Korean town were designed or built for and by Korean immigrants. So as you can see, there are not many Spanish signboards or menus or explanations, and also there probably because of the cultural language barriers, Korean community was well known as very cohesive communities or with a strong ethnic solidarity in Argentinian society. Sometimes it also this community was understood as very closed and isolated. Well, as Romina mentioned earlier, we could recover the first moment of revalorization of Hansik in this migratory process. For these migrants in early period, obviously food from home gave great comfort, mitigating the psychological trauma and of displacement, and also giving some sense of belonging. As these food practices take particular meanings as vehicle for identity construction, Korean women's cultural capital become more valid. Well, also food work, traditionally considered as a feminine domestic work, was not limited at home or private spaces, but also community space such as churches or Korean schools or ethnic restaurants in this area. So as a result, the cultural capital related to Korean food also translated into potential venture possibility for this human or this immigrant family.
Well, what we consider the second moment of revalorization of this culinary capital is triggered by the interaction of multiple global and local phenomena, but among them we consider two of them as the more relevant. In the first place, the state policy developed by the South Korean state related to the cultural industries in general, also known as Hallyu, that maybe you have heard of, and especially related to the traditional cuisine, Hansik. And even though these policies started to be implemented some decades ago, in the last decade, it has gained a special boost. In 2010, the Hansik Globalization Project was launched with the pursuit of favoring the image of Korea through its culinary culture. And in 2014, so in the last 5 or 6 years, these practices started to materialize in Buenos Aires, mainly organized by the Korean Cultural Center and the Republic of Korea Embassy. So here we can see in one of the photos on the left, the a lecture on kimchi in the Cultural Center, food week organized by also by the Korean Center and the Embassy. There you can see the sign. And then the other photo is about the kimchi bus that came to Buenos Aires in 2014 as well, and performed demonstrations of some iconic Korean dishes. And the second phenomena that we recognize as being involved in this valorization is related to the changes that took place in the last decades on how ethnicity, race, cultural diversity, and national identity is perceived and represented in Argentina, and especially in Buenos Aires. And what can be defined as a multicultural turn. So in this context, for example, the city government has organized Buenos Aires Celebra, that you can see on the right side of the slide, some photos about it. That's a program that celebrates the migrant communities through events performed in the public space, where traditional music, dances, clothes, and especially food are the focus. And if we go to the next slide, Gastro Korea Food Week was organized in last October 2019. And unlike the events described before, this one was a civil society initiative. A group of 3 Korean Argentinians and an Argentinian food entrepreneur without Korean descent were the organizers. And in this case, 20 Korean restaurants prepared special menus for the week with the aim to promote Korean food in the local society and attract more non-Korean consumers. And some non-Korean restaurants also participated in fusioning Korean plates with their regular menu. And this event put Korean women on the spot. And next we will see some of the peculiarities of its promotional campaign. And if we go to the next slide, we can, well, there you have the image of one of the videos, the promotional videos. Maybe the Gastro Korea focused its publicity on social media, and they had some Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube pages, and where they showed 5 cooks, 4 women and 1 man, who in these promotional videos share their life stories and their relation to food. And in food includes family and ancestors, but in female stories, this dimension is more stressed, as we can see. And you can, on the right part of the slide, you can see some of the main arguments of this Korean cook. And if you're interested, we can all late give you the links to watch the videos, but you can also search on YouTube about Gastro Korea, and there you have all the videos. But well, besides these gender differences, Gastro Korea social media campaign allowed, in a way, Korean Argentinian female cooks to tell their life stories in their own voices and put into words their ideas about what Korean cuisine is and should be. Well, if you go to the next one, well, both on video and photos, women are dressed in traditional Korean clothes. Meanwhile, the male cook wears a professional cook outfit, as you can see in the photos. We find that these outfits emphasize the idea that for female cooks, their expertise in Korean food is attached to ethnicity and family, while in the case of the male cook, it is legitimated by his professional formation. And I think that when I was hearing the previous presentations on the previous panel, some of these was also mentioned about different TV series and how female cooks and male cooks are represented. Well, if we go to the next slide, also focusing on media spaces, we also found that in the last year, Korean female cooks also start to appear in traditional media spaces. In the last year, one of the main gastronomic TV channels in Latin America got an Asian cuisine show hosted by a Korean Argentinian young chef, Marina, who also runs her own restaurant in Buenos Aires. The show is presented with the objective to bring the Asian cuisine closer to a Latin American audience in a way they can recreate the recipes at home. And if we focus in the second kind of space where Korean Argentinians are starting to perform agency and on their culinary capital, we can see here an institutional space of culinary institutes. The Argentine Institute of Gastronomy, one of the most prestigious culinary schools in Buenos Aires, has had in the last years, on the one hand, an increased participation of Korean Argentinians from second and third generations as students. And on the other hand, this valorization of Korean cuisine encourages presence in the institute curricula, even though still in a marginalized way. So even though the curricula doesn't include any mandatory courses on Korean cuisine, since 2018, a former student, a Korean Argentinian woman and restaurant owner, Sandra Lee, imparts a kimchi and handshake workshop aimed at students and former students of the institute. So we find that an increase in Korean cuisine prestige allowed this tradition to enter the space of culinary professional education in Buenos Aires, and in Spain allowed Korean Argentinian women to position themselves in the place of educators. And now I let you, Chong, to continue.
Well, along with these other kinds of spaces that we see the presence, increasing presence of Korean women in Buenos Aires, we also see the territorial changing patterns in the city. So these maps show the locations of Korean restaurants throughout the last decade, 2014 and 2017, and this year, 2020. As we can clearly see and observe the positioning of Korean restaurants in the city's landscape. For example, since 2018, we observed that at least 6 new Korean restaurants have been established or relocated in the center or Chuleta or Centro. It means significant for the city because they went beyond the ethnic enclaves of the Korean communities. Even if it is geographical expansion in the city center is driven by the restaurant's owner, it also should be understood as a contested place or resort because of the demand of the local residents or the consumers. So, for example, there are these photos restaurant nearby the metro station. It's called Kasongseong, and there is another restaurant, Mr. Ho, that opened last year. So it became a popular door hotspot or somewhat trendy lunch places for the many office workers, allowing them to access and experience Korean food on more daily basis. And these photos are taken in Palermo, one restaurant, actually from this Marina Liz that mentioned Romina. She cooks usually fusion Korean food, and then it's very popular among these local foodies or some tourist people. And well, this is a photo of a small alley, Luperto Godoy in Avellaneda, the new Korean enclave. And this has turned into a popular urban spot among the local dwellers that used to be very quite exclusive until a few years ago. As she explained, as a consequence of this revalorization of Korean food during the last few years. Sorry.
Excusez-moi de vous interrompre. Il va falloir que vous cherchiez.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you might consider concluding. You just have a
changes landscape and was Argentinian and non-Korean customers. There's a new menus in Spanish and modern destination, including official license for the restaurants. According to Ziglia, this transformation understood as part of the world's way of practicing the urban spaces in Buenos Aires. In sense, we observe new process practices of Korean women in the community. The photos on the left side is traditional Korean supermarket, and on the right side is the new Korean restaurant that attracts more local local people with Spanish levels and more various products from Asia. So, but this also implies that there are a lot of Korean women, and one woman said these days there are a lot of Korean women at home working, preparing this kind of ready-to-eat meals at home and sell to these kind of restaurant, supermarkets. Well, to wrap up our presentation, we observe global and local phenomena are articulated, Hansik enhanced its value and status in Buenos Aires. We identified two moments in this process. The first one related to the consumption in the community, and the last one to broaden public. Through this process, the women's culinary capital also became enhanced and devalued, and eventually affecting their incomes, life projects, and urban practices. But at the same time, we see contradictions performance of Hansik, but also represented mostly through idea of care and family and motherhood. For the further research, we know that there are a lot of restaurants struggling not to close this time, including the Korean restaurants. So we would like to ask how this pandemic would influence on women's use of the culinary capital, and also in which ways does this process have repercussions on gender relations in other dimensions. Thank you very much.